Hello again. Here we are for Death of a Salesman, Act 2. This is the last lecture that you'll be getting before the spring break, which I hope you will all enjoy, and then we will resume thereafter. Now, although Arthur Miller claims that in tragedy, an audience should always have a sense that the protagonist could triumph, that isn't simply that he simply isn't overpowered by outer or inner forces of destiny. We find nonetheless that he has titled this play Death of a Salesman, and seems in doing so to remove any suspense about Willie Loman's end, as if somehow, for us at least, it is foretold and predestined. We might have a kind of theoretical capacity, Willie might, to overcome obstacles of age and mental decline and his past mistakes. That may be theoretically true for Miller, but the title indicates that, in fact, that's not going to happen. He isn't going to triumph. He's going to die. We wait, then, for him to die, and the question is how and under what conditions that will occur. So when Act 2 begins and Willie leaves for his meeting with his boss, Howard, full of artificial confidence, we anticipate failure rather than success. And Miller foreshadows this in Willie's comment about their refrigerator just before he walks out the door. Looking at it, he says, "I'm always in a race with the junkyard. I just finished paying off the car and it's now on its last legs. The refrigerator consumes belts like a goddamn maniac. They time those things. They time them so that when you finally paid up, they're used up." Now, Willie could be describing himself here rather than an appliance. He too is old and used up. He too is breaking down in body and mind. He too is obsolete. Like his car, the fridge is racing to the junkyard, just as Willie is racing toward death as an escape, even though another part of Willie, as we shall see, struggles still to cling to some hope for life, principally hope in Biff. Like the cheap home appliances and car that Willie bought, he himself was never equipped to succeed in the long term as a salesman, and he certainly is not equipped to survive now among the more aggressively business-driven practices of post-war America. Charlie, who sometimes lends Willie money and pities him for his delusions, makes Willie's insufficiencies as a salesman very clear. He says, "The only thing you got in this world is what you can sell, Willie, and the funny thing is that you're a salesman and you don't know that." Willie says, "I've always tried to think otherwise. I guess I always felt that if a man was impressive and well-liked, that nothing," to which Charlie says, "Why must everybody like you? Who liked J.P. Morgan?" Oh, well, says, "You're just jealous of me. No, I can't work for you. I can't work for you, Charlie. That's all. Don't ask me why." Now, Willie has either failed to realize or refused to realize that a salesman has a product to sell, that he is not primarily selling himself, he's selling his goods. And it is telling that we never really learn what the specific line of products that Willie is selling for all these years is. And it reflects the fact that Willie is less interested in his case of samples than he is in winning approval among his peers, in being liked both by fellow salesmen and by customers. But they don't buy from him. When Willie arrives in Howard's office, this young inheritor of the company that his father founded pointedly ignores Willie and then dismisses him. Howard is preoccupied instead with a new tape recorder, the kind of modern technological gadget in post-war America that represents a changing world, one that has left Willie behind and is indeed increasingly closed to him. Willie is, after all, so anachronistic himself in this post-war world that he is even mystified by some new innovation like whipped cheese. Now, I sent you a link to this painful scene with Howard from a 1985 rather celebrated version of the play starring Dustin Hoffman as Willie Loman. And as I hope you've now seen in the clip, everything that takes place is a systematic stripping away of Willie's dignity. Willie has come to ask if he can spend less time on the road in New England and can work instead his final years in New York City. He makes this appeal based on his 34 years with the company, pointing out to Howard his close relationship with Howard's father at a time when Howard himself was just a baby. Howard's complete disinterest in Willie, or what he has to say, forces Willie to beg, which is already an assault on Willie's dignity, his place in the world. And when this begging fails, Willie argues for the respect at least his age ought to command. And finally, in desperation, Willie cites a somewhat ambiguous pledge or promise that he says Howard's father made to him many years before. Willie claims that the founder promised to take care of him. Now, this is perhaps, even probably, an exaggeration of the kind Willie is prone to, but there may in fact be some spirit of truth in this understanding between himself and Howard's father. Now, when all of these ploys fail to move Howard, Willie tries to appeal to a basic sense of humanity that he hopes is in Howard by citing his financial straits. All the while, the tape recorder is still playing and holding most of Howard's interest. Willie says, "I'm talking about your father, Howard. There were promises made across this desk. You mustn't tell me you've got people to see. I put 34 years into this firm, Howard, and now I can't pay my insurance. You can't eat the orange and throw the peel away. A man is not a piece of fruit. Now, pay attention. Your father in 1928, I had a big year. I averaged $170 a week in commissions." Howard says impatiently, "Now, Willie, you never averaged." "Oh, I averaged almost 170. Meanwhile, in the background, this mechanical device continues. "The capital of New York is Albany. The capital of Ohio is Cincinnati. The capital of Rhode Island is." Now, it is not accidental that the capital of Ohio is not Cincinnati. It's Columbus. And that's notable because everything about Howard is wrong. His insensitivity to Willie here, his disregard for him, tossing him away, as Willie says, like the peel of an orange, is inhuman. Instead of giving Willie the job that he has asked for, Howard instead strips Willie of everything, of his position in the company entirely. Effectively, he fires him. Howard says, "Willie, you can't go to Boston for us." "Why can't I go?" "I don't want you to represent us. I've been meaning to tell you for a long time now." "Howard, are you firing me?" "I think you need a good long rest, Willie." "Where are your sons? Why don't you give your sons a hand?" They're working on a very big deal, Howard." "Oh, well, this is no time for false pride, Willie. You go with your sons then, and you tell them you're very tired, and you've got two great boys, haven't you? Haven't you?" "Oh, no question about that." "Then that's that, eh, Willie? All right, I'll go to Boston." Or, no Boston. I can't throw myself on my sons. I'm not a cripple." Now, Miller's model of stripping away an old man of everything that he possesses, including his pride here, is based, I think, almost certainly on a famous scene in Shakespeare's King Lear, in which Lear's heartless daughters, Goneril and Regan, humiliate the aging Lear by divesting him of his men, of his possessions, and finally of his home. This is essentially this robbing of possessions, dignity, and stature, what Howard does to Willie here. Howard tells Willie, in the passage I read, to rely on his sons, and we know that indeed Willie has wanted to live through them, especially Biff, for years, but they have still failed him consistently in one way or another. And even now, Willie cannot bear to look like a complete failure in their eyes, even though he feels they have failed him. The agonizing ordeal of abject disgrace and humiliation with Howard, combined with these thoughts that Howard has mentioned about his two sons, triggers two important memories played out on stage at this point in the play in Willie's mind. The first is of another visit by Willie's older brother, Ben, and in this visit, Willie's failure to seize what he thinks might have been a life-defining opportunity. This is followed by Willie's memory of Biff's triumph on the football field, the proudest day in Willie's life. But in both memories, we find a moment of either real or potential triumph gives way in the memory to a recollection of loss and failure. Now, before we consider these two memories, however, I want you to consider for a moment this question. Miller says, you remember, that tragedy enlists the audience's sympathetic fear, and that we sense that fearfully we could suffer the same circumstances as the protagonist. But Miller, in his essay, objects to Aristotle's claim that through this identification with the tragic figure, we also feel pity. Because pity, he suggests, is not a tragic emotion. It is rather what we feel in the face of sheer hopelessness. And remember, Miller's tragic heroes are never supposed to be hopeless, notwithstanding the title of this play. But I wonder, does that theory that tragedy is incompatible with pity really work in the scene with Howard? It is difficult when we watch that not to feel deep pity for Willie here. And notwithstanding Miller's theory of tragedy, it's hard to imagine that Willie could ever really have succeeded in salvaging his dignity in this scene. It doesn't seem like a possibility. Well, Willie's memory of Ben follows an earlier memory of Ben that may or may not be part of the same visit. Once again, Ben carries a phallic umbrella, the one that he points at Biff's eye, you'll remember, that image of his own castrating power. Ben is, at this moment, in the memory, on his way to Alaska, undertaking it with the same fervor and confidence and recklessness that earlier he brought into the African jungles to acquire diamonds to stake his fortune. He offers Willie now an invitation to join him, and he offers him a job in the far north, what he calls, with a misguided sense of geography, a new continent at your doorstep. Why does Willie refuse this golden opportunity? So it would seem. Well, according to Willie's memory, he declined because Linda urged him to. But Linda's estimate of Willie's success in New York is based partly on Willie's own exaggerations. Linda says to Ben, Willie says, Linda, Ben's got a proposition for me in Alaska. Linda says, but you've got to Ben. He's got a beautiful job here, Ben. Oh, but in Alaska, he tells his wife, I could, to which Linda then replies, frightened of Ben and also angry at him, why must everybody conquer the world? You're well liked, Willie, and the boys love you, and someday, she turns to Ben, why, old man Wagner told me just the other day if he keeps it up, he'll be a member of the firm, didn't he, Willie? This is undoubtedly a false claim that Willie made about Howard's father. But Linda, to whom he sometimes confesses the truth, is also a repository of many of Willie's exaggerations and lies, and based on those lies, she makes this estimate of his inevitable triumph and rise in his job as a salesman in New York. Linda's support for Willie's dream of being respected and becoming wealthy as a salesman by being well liked feeds Willie's own misguided belief in that dream, which he recites to Ben in a state of fevered fantasy as he turns down the invitation. He says to Ben, it's not what you do, Ben. It's who you know and the smile on your face. It's contacts, Ben, contacts. The whole wealth of Alaska passes over a lunch table at the Commodore Hotel in New York. And that's the wonder of this country, that a man can end with diamonds here on the basis just of being liked. He turns to Biff. And that's why you get that's why you get out on that field today. It's so important because thousands of people will be rooting for you and loving you. Now, note that Willie's confidence has been stoked up by Linda to reinforce him. But the problem is, of course, that he is lying to Linda so that this artificial inflation of his own ego through his own efforts, based on her words, is finally fraudulent. Willie isn't succeeding by trying to be liked. Years later, Willie looks back on this moment, this juncture in the road of his life, and sees it with regret as a crucial mistake. But think about it. Even if Willie had accepted Ben's offer, it is unlikely that he could have flourished in Alaska, because we know that Willie is temperamentally unsuited to succeed in the cutthroat Darwinian world of venture capitalism that Ben represents. He's having a hard enough time just succeeding or even surviving as a salesman. Now, in the next memory, which grows out of this one, Willie turns instead to Biff for vicarious validation. Not to Linda, but now to Biff. And in this memory, he finds again a sense of loss, of a turning away from the moment of opportunity. Because in the memory, we'll see, Charlie mocks Willie's overstated importance of Biff's high school glory on the football field. Willie claims that that's preparation for success in life, and Charlie knows better. But Willie identifies so closely, vicariously, so desperately with Biff's gridiron triumphs that he threatens to punch his neighbor, who is simply trying to make Willie look at the world realistically and keep him from inculcating in his son a misguided idea that popularity will always trump effort. Charlie is aware of this. Now, when we return then to the present, we find that Willie has come to Charlie's office after being fired in order to borrow money to maintain his insurance payment. This is the one bill that Willie always pays because his plan, which he entertains and represses by turns, is to kill himself and leave a $150,000 insurance payout for Linda. When he arrives at Charlie's office, he sees Charlie's son Bernard, who is visiting. Bernard, who you remember was to tutor Biff in math years earlier, Bernard, not surprisingly, has succeeded by his own efforts and intelligence and is now a successful Washington lawyer and a married man whose rise in the world prompts Willie to ask why Biff, who had been his tutee and who had been ever so much more popular in high school, why Biff never lived up to his promise, never achieved anything approaching Bernard's maturity or confidence or sense of direction. This baffles Willie. Willie says, I'm overjoyed to see how you made the grade, Bernard. Overjoyed. It's encouraging a thing to see a young man really, you look great. He looks great. He breaks off. Bernard, well, what is it, Willie? Small and alone. What's the secret? What secret, Willie? How did you do it? Why didn't Biff ever catch on? I wouldn't know that, Willie. But it is significant that Bernard is mystified himself at Biff's decline. But he does present some information that leads Willie to a horrifying confrontation with his own failure as a father and the immediate cause of Biff's inability to find himself or to believe in himself after high school. For years, Willie has been suppressing a crucial memory related to this failure on Biff's part, and he has repressed it, Willie has, because of the terrible guilt, obviously, attached to it. Here was what Bernard tells him. There's just one thing I've always wanted to ask you, Willie. When he was supposed to graduate and the math teacher flunked Biff, oh, that son of a bitch ruined his life. Well, he flunked the subject and he laid down after that, Willie says, and he died just like a hammer hit him. Bernard says, take it easy, kid. Willie, let me talk to you. I got nobody else to talk to, Bernard. Bernard, was it my fault? You see, it keeps coming round in my mind. Maybe I did something to him. I got nothing to give him. Bernard says, you know what? Well, there were lots of things. He flunked math, and he wasn't going to graduate, but Biff wasn't beaten by all that. But then, Willie, he disappeared from the block for almost a month. I got the idea that he'd gone up to New England to see you. Did he ever talk with you? Well, Willie stares in silence. Willie? Yeah, he came up to Boston. To which Bernard then says, well, He came back after that month and took his sneakers. Remember those sneakers with University of Virginia printed on them? He was so proud of those, wore them every day, and he took them down in the cellar and burned them up in the furnace. I've often thought of how strange it was that I knew he'd given up his life. What happened in Boston, Willie? Now, note, why did Biff go to Boston after failing his math exam? Why didn't he go to summer school so that he could graduate and take up the football scholarship at Virginia? If, as Bernard tells Willie, he wasn't beaten by those things. No, he could have overcome them. He wasn't beaten. Well, Willie can no longer hide the truth from himself. It's been gnawing at him, and he doesn't want to acknowledge it, but now, with this trigger, he must. Biff went to Boston, we discover, through Willie's recollection, for 3 reasons. First, to confess his failure to Willie for failing math and not being able to graduate. When he arrives, he said, "Dad, I let you down." "What do you mean?" Dad, the term, "I haven't got enough credits to graduate." All right, part of it is then a confession to his father. But he also took the train up to Boston abruptly to ask for Willie's help with the teacher, an expression of his confidence in his father to do anything through sheer force of personality, as Willie has claimed he pretty much could do in all of the exaggerated tales that he has told his sons. Biff says, "Birnbaum absolutely refused to pass me. I begged him, Pop, but he won't let me get those graduation points. But if he saw the kind of man you are, and you just talk to him in your way, I'm sure he'd come through." It's a gesture of extraordinary confidence, a leap of faith, but one that Biff feels is well grounded in what he believes about his father. But above all, Biff goes to see Willie on the road for a third reason, to restore his faith in himself, something that Willie has supported with the continual idea of Biff's own specialness all the way through his youth. And although, as Bernard says, he wasn't beaten at this point, he still needs some buffing up. This is perhaps the most important reason why he comes. But instead, when Biff arrives, he finds that Willie has been sleeping with the woman. His idea of his father is instantaneously shattered, and with it, Biff's idea of himself that has rested upon his belief in Willie's truth-telling, in Willie's reliability, in the truthfulness of Willie's assessment of his own specialness. All of that is destroyed. Now he sees his father as a fraud and questions his own legitimacy as a young man of talent. Now, the woman enters to see Biff holding a box of stockings that Willie has given. As she enters, Biff sees her holding this box of stockings that Willie has given her as a kind of exchange for sex. It makes the sexual betrayal that Biff sees of Linda, his mother, even worse, because earlier we noted that Linda is mending her own torn stockings at a time now, Biff realizes, when Willie has been giving new ones to his mistress. It's more than he can bear. The woman enters holding a box of stockings. She says, "Oh, I hope there's nobody out in the hall since they're pushing me out." And the woman then, angry and humiliated at being forced to leave by Willie, who is so enraged, "Get out of here, for God's sake," departs. After she leaves, Willie, embarrassed, turns to his son and pretends that nothing has happened. "What's the matter?" Biff remains motionless, tears falling. "She's just a buyer for J.H. Simmons. She lives down the hall. They're painting. Don't you imagine?" He breaks off. He knows his son is not buying this. "All right, get my suits. Biff, don't move. Now stop crying, as I say. I gave you an order. Biff, I gave you an order." "How dare you cry, Biff," putting his arm around Biff. "Look, Biff, when you grow up, you'll understand about these things. You mustn't overemphasize a thing like this. I'll see Birnbaum. I'll see the teacher first thing in the morning." "Never mind," Willie getting down beside Biff. "Never mind. He's going to give you those points. I'll see to it." "No, he wouldn't listen to you." Willie then says, "Biff, she's nothing to me. I was lonely. I was terribly lonely. You gave her mama's stockings. The tears break through and he rises to go. Willie grabbing for Biff. I gave you an order. Don't touch me. Apologize for that. You fake, Biff tells Willie. You phony little fake. You fake. Okay. Dramatic climax. Now, note that Biff has come to Willie's hotel room only because Willie has previously, in the moments before this, ignored both the phone call that he made and the buzzer intercom. Willie didn't answer either of these because he doesn't want anyone to know where he is, and he doesn't want to know because he's ashamed and guilty about this clandestine affair even before Biff's discovery of it. He knows it's wrong. It is, as he tells Biff, that he was lonely, and he is lonely, but that is, of course, an absolutely lame excuse. Willie's loneliness seems to be a result of his overbearing attempts to be liked as a salesman, and the more he tries to be liked, the more aggressively he tries to glad-hand other individuals and be popular, the more his fellow salesmen and his clients seem to turn away from him. Biff's subsequent failure to graduate from high school, to go to college, to get a permanent job, to marry, and even to stay out of jail, all of which are a series of failures over 15 to 16 years, follow this decisive scene, this result of a loss of faith in Willie, a loss of faith in Biff himself, and above all, perhaps, a loss of faith in Willie's fraudulent gospel that popularity is a key to success. Biff sees in his own life and in Willie's at this moment, it isn't. Instead, what he sees in the hotel room in Boston is a pathetic, isolated, unsuccessful man. But far worse, he sees Willie as a fake, who both as a father and a husband has lied to his sons about his successes and lied to his wife Linda by carrying on an affair behind her back. Willie bears the blame for all of this. But one must also note, I think, that Biff's failures in adult life, and they are numerous, are also in part forms of self-subversion. Yet the very impulse to subvert himself, one might say in Biff, also traces back to Willie, and specifically to that scene in Boston. Here's what I mean. Biff knows how much Willie has invested in him, how much hope, how much vicarious longing for him to succeed. And it is as if then, perhaps unconsciously, that Biff is punishing Willie by falling short of his father's extravagant hopes for him, in subverting himself, subverting Willie for betraying him. Now, this way, Willie feels, of course, betrayed by Biff's failures, the same way Biff, years before, felt betrayed by Willie as an adulterer and a fake when he saw him in Boston. Yet, as we'll see, while each feels the other has betrayed his idea of what he believed in and valued in the other, neither Biff nor Willie can bear fully to acknowledge that the other regards him as a failure. They both feel agony at the idea, still, that the other regards them as a ne'er-do-well. And as a result of that, Willie continues to brag to Biff and others about how he'll turn the corner in sales, and Biff continues to try to please Willie intermittently by suggesting that he will somehow yet make it as a businessman in New York. There's this terrible fear of having father or son see the other as absolutely useless. Now, the meeting that has been arranged in Manhattan at a steakhouse was to celebrate what Willie and Biff falsely imagined, particularly Willie, might be triumphant meetings in the city for business dealings. It comes, of course, on the heels, though, this would-be celebratory meeting, of two disastrous encounters. Biff's meeting with Oliver and Willie's catastrophic interview with Howard. And in a curious way, the failure of these two meetings reveals how much Willie and Biff are alike in their failures, in their shame at being so easily dismissed, in their resentment of one another, and in their enduring need for each other. In all of those ways, they're doubles. Now, each Biff and Willie confesses his failure to the other that day, painfully, and each then blames the other for contributing to that failure. Here's what happens to Biff in his meeting with Oliver as he describes it. First, to his brother, Happy. "Did you see Oliver?" Biff breathlessly. "Yeah, I saw him in New York, yes." He says it didn't go well. And then he adds breathlessly, "I did a terrible thing today, Hap. It's been the strangest day I ever went through. I'm all numb, I swear." Well, Happy says, "You mean he wouldn't see you?" "Well, I waited 6 hours for him, see, all day. Kept sending my name in. Even tried to date his secretary so she'd get me in to see him, but no so. Finally, about 5 o'clock, he comes out. Didn't remember who I was or anything. I felt like such an idiot, Hap. Did you tell him about my Florida idea? Oh, he walked away. I saw him for 1 minute. I got so mad I could have torn the walls down. He gave me one look, and I realized what a ridiculous lie my whole life has been. We've been walking in a dream for 15 years. I was a shipping clerk for him, nothing more. Well, what did you do?" Well, he left, you see, and I don't know what came over me, Hap. The next thing I know, I'm in his office, paneled walls, everything. I can't explain it. Hap, I took his fountain pen, and I ran and ran and ran." "Well, that was awfully dumb. What'd you do that for?" "I don't know. I wanted to take something. I don't know. You got to help me, Hap. I'm going to tell Pop." "Oh, Hap, he's got to understand that I'm not the man somebody lends that kind of money to. Dad thinks he's been spiting me all these years, and it's eating him up. I've been spiting him, and he's eating it up. But he has to understand that I'm not worthy of his investment of faith in me." Okay, now note, why does Biff, who has been arrested for theft, we learn in the past, steal Oliver's expensive fountain pen after he has been ignored, dismissed? The crime isn't directed at Oliver, but at Willie and at Biff himself. It's a way of Biff in which Biff punishes himself by confirming in his own mind his sense of himself as a failure, a scoundrel, a good-for-nothing. But it is also this theft of a wealthy man's fountain pen, an indirect assault on Willie, who had tacitly, remember, encouraged Biff's theft of the football and lumber when Biff was an adolescent. It's as if Biff wants, when he says, "I have to tell Willie this," he wants Willie to know where the distorted lessons he imparted to him have led, as if to say, in disclosing this theft, "This is what you encouraged me to do." But one might say that when Biff says, "I don't know why I stole it," he doesn't consciously understand either the way in which it's directed against himself or against Willie at this point. He tells Happy he doesn't know why he took the pen, but I think we do. Now, insofar as the theft is directed against Willie, as I've suggested, there is another purpose in it. And that is, although Biff is agonized at Willie's loss of faith in him, he also can't bear that faith. He can't bear Willie's hope. This in some way he does understand when at the end of it he says, "Willie's got to understand I'm not the man somebody lends that money to. He thinks I've been spiting him all these years and it's eating him up, but I'm not spiting him, I just can't do it." Now, note that the crime then is a way, and disclosing the crime to Willie is a way on Biff's part of trying to get Willie to stop investing those extravagant, vicarious hopes and feelings in him. Because for Biff, they are a burden. It is a pain to think that his father regards him as a ne'er-do-well, but it is more unbearable to see his father continue to have hope for him when he feels he cannot fulfill it. This is why he wants and insists on telling Willie what he has done. And in a very different spirit than when he came to Boston to confess that he had flunked math. That was an actual confession because he felt guilty, this is a confession because he needs to free himself of Willie's expectations. A little bit later, when he makes this confession, it so enrages Willie that Willie strikes Biff and falters away from the table. "You little rotten louse, you are spiting me." Well, of course, Biff had said he thinks I'm spiting him. You know, it's not that. I cannot bear the burden of his expectations. On the other hand, in part, he is spiting Willie to the extent that he wants to show Willie through the theft of the fountain pen where Willie's lessons had gotten him. To which Biff says, after being accused of spiting him, "No, it's just that I'm no good. Can't you see what I am?" Now, Willie understands that Biff is spiting him himself, in part in order to spite him, but he doesn't see that Biff needs to be freed through this gesture of the agony of Willie's expectations. In telling Willie what happened at the failed meeting with Oliver, Biff implicitly blames Willie for filling him with the ideas that he could charm his way to financial success, exaggerate what he needed to, steal and get away from it. That, one might say, was a form of spite. But on the other hand, the desire to escape his father's expectations by describing this isn't. He says, "Yeah, Oliver, all day as a matter of fact, and a lot of instances, in fact, Pop. Facts about my life came back to me then. Who was it, Pop? Whoever said I was a salesman with Oliver?" "Well, you were," Willie said. "No, Dad, I was a shipping clerk. That's one of the ideas you pumped my head full of." And again, a little bit later, he wants to remind Willie, in this disclosure of failure and theft, how in some ways the lesson traces back to Willie. Biff, agonized, holds Willie down. "No, look, Pop, I'm supposed to have lunch with him tomorrow. I'm just telling you, you'll know it. You'll make an impression." But he then says, "Listen, I took those balls years ago, and now I walk in with the guy's fountain pen. That clinches it, don't you see? I can't face him. I'll try elsewhere." Who was it that told him it was all right to take the football? Willie had. Now, while Biff casts blame on Willie here, both for betraying his idea of himself and for making him the ne'er-do-well he has become, Willie, on the other hand, tries to deny guilt for both of these things. And he projects that guilt rather than accepting it by blaming Biff entirely for his own failures, and also blaming Biff in the process for destroying his vicarious dreams in him. When they're at the table, Biff says, "So I'm washed up with Oliver, do you understand? Are you listening to me?" Willie, at a loss, says, "Yeah, if you hadn't flunked." Biff, "Flunked what? What are you talking about?" Willie, "Don't blame everything on me. I didn't flunk math. You did. Well, note that part of Biff needs for Willie, as we've seen, to cast him off, to let him go, to stop investing faith in him because it's a burden, to free him from the weight of his parental expectation. But as I've noted, another part of Biff, when he sees Willie in this state of acute disappointment, even as Willie is also trying to deny his own guilt, in this state of terrible agony, another part of Biff simply cannot stand to see that. It's unbearable. And so, in the midst of this disclosure about the terrible outcome of the meeting and the theft, seeing his father like this, Biff tries to retreat. And all the more so because, remember, Linda that previous day had told Biff that he is the only one who can save Willie from suicide by somehow filling Willie with hope in him. Here's what he says when he sees how wounded his father is at his disclosures of what really happened. He feels the need to feed him more false hope. That's when suddenly he changes direction and tells him that there is in fact going to be a meeting. This pumps Willie up. Biff says, "I can't bear the look on his face." He's ready to weep, which is why he says, "Look, Pop, I'm supposed to have lunch with him tomorrow. I'm just telling you this so you'll know that I can still make an impression, Pop, and I'll make good somewhere, but I can't go tomorrow, but I will someday." This attempt somehow to save Willie from suicide, to save him from agony, and to save Biff himself from the terrible sense that he has disappointed his father, even though another part of him is blaming his father and still another part is trying to free himself from the burden of his father's expectations. Now, note that Biff is, of course, in claiming that there will be some future meeting with Oliver, fabricating in order to provide an alternative to Willie's complete despair. But of course, in doing so, he is telling a lie, and lies are the very thing that he hates above all in Willie, who also has lied and exaggerated to Biff and to others as a complete stay against his own despair. But Biff's sense of Willie, as he puts it, as a fake, as a fraud, who's exaggerated his minimal successes, who's cheated on his wife, who has encouraged lying in others, he hates Willie's dishonesty, and yet in order to try in some way to apply a balm to this agonized old man, he lies himself in making up this story of some possible hope that will redeem him with Oliver. Now, ultimately, Willie has unwittingly then cast Biff in his own flawed image, one who lies and one who exaggerates when necessary, if though for different reasons. And again, we've seen the many, many ways in which they are alike. Perhaps Biff sees this fact of his lying as somehow a replication of what he hates in his father. Perhaps he sees it because, having tried then to give Willie some slender sense of hope about a future meeting with Oliver, when Willie insists that Biff go to this imaginary luncheon, that's more than Biff can bear. And then Biff turns again and admits that no, that was a lie, that in fact there was no appointment arranged or ever discussed. This is when Willie slaps him. What Willie is doing is really striking out at the image of his own past and present failure in Biff. But in slapping his son, Willie is also displacing the guilt that he feels for derailing his son's life, the life of this favored son, because we know by this point he has already had the memory, that repressed memory of what happened in the hotel room, and understands the devastating, deleterious effect it had on Biff thereafter. Seeing again Willie's anguish, Biff is now so stricken with guilt for hurting him that he can scarcely bear it. He sees Willie at this moment as tragic, and as Willie staggers away toward the restroom, he tells Miss Forsythe, one of the two call girls, quote, "You've just seen a prince walk by, a fine troubled prince, a hard-working, unappreciated prince." Okay. Now, while this psychodrama of blame and guilt between Biff and Willie is going on, the other son, Happy, is more or less out of it, carrying on the seduction, one of his many seductions, of a call girl, and revealing that while Willie's infidelity disillusioned Biff fatally, that infidelity is a trait that Happy has acquired, and though he may hate himself and his life for it, he nonetheless practices it. Remember that Happy didn't share Biff's deep disillusionment in learning that Willie was a fraud given to exaggeration, because he wasn't there in the hotel room, for one thing, but also because Happy didn't invest nearly as much belief in his father's greatness as Biff did. And he knew also that Willie never invested nearly as much hope vicariously in him as he did in the favored Biff. I noted last time that Happy understandably resents this particular favoritism, and he makes this resentment clear as he leaves the restaurant with the call girl. He wants to dissociate himself from this father who he feels was not just a failure, but never valued him as much as his brother, and seems not to value his own financial success, but rather seems skeptical of it because Happy isn't a popular man. Thus, after Biff says, "I can't bear to look at his face, he's ready to weep," Happy says as they go out, when Lettuce says, don't you want to tell your father we're leaving? Happy says, no, that's not my father there. He's just a guy. Come on. Biff asks him, doesn't he mean anything to you? Happy says, I don't know. Me? Yeah. Clearly, his real feelings are coming out here. But to say, pointing to his father as he walks away, he's just a guy. This is the worst insult that Willie could ever receive from anyone, let alone a son. Because it's not just that Happy is refusing to acknowledge his own father. It's the charge of mediocrity. Just a guy. That is the most terrible assault on Willie's dignity. Willie may be a common man, but he cannot and will not see himself as an ordinary man, as just a guy. When Happy and Biff return home without Willie, they attempt to atone to their mother for the guilt they feel, particularly Biff, at abandoning him by bringing her flowers. Linda, in turn, accuses them, rightly, of desertion, knocks the roses to the floor, and orders the two sons to leave the house, fiercely protective of Willie. She is, without question, the moral center of this play. But beyond their desertion, what Linda cannot forgive them for is for failing Willie, particularly Biff, and in so doing, robbing Willie of his hope and the dignity that attaches to that hope for a better future through his son's prospect of working with Oliver. She tells them, get out of here, both of you, and don't come back. I don't want you tormenting him anymore. Go on now. Get your things together, to Biff. You can sleep in his apartment. You're a pair of animals. Not one, not another living soul would have had the cruelty to walk out on that man in a restaurant. He is so humiliated, he nearly limped when he came in. Biff says, oh, yes, you're right. I left him babbling in a toilet. You louse, you, Linda says. No, not a bit on you. Now you hit it on the nose. He gets up and throws the flowers on the waste paper can. The scum of the earth. You're looking at him. That's me. Get out. Well, Biff embraces his mother's scorn as a necessary punishment. He hates himself, but he goes beyond just that. His words, I'm the scum of the earth, are so extreme that they border on masochism. It's almost as if Biff feels at this moment, having failed his father, deserted his father, and been a ne'er-do-well his entire life, it's almost now as if he takes a kind of pleasure in degradation, because disgrace and degradation are almost a kind of relief for him. A little bit later, he says to Willie, Willie, I ran down 11 flights with a pen in my hand today, and suddenly I stopped to hear me, and in the middle of that office building to hear me, I stopped in the middle, and I saw the sky. I saw the sky, you know, and I realized, though, what am I doing in an office? Making a contemptuous, begging fool of myself, when all I want is to be out there waiting for me the minute I say I know who I am. Why can't I say that, Willie? Why can't I? To which Willie then says, the door of your life is wide open. And Biff then says, Pop, no. I'm a dime a dozen, and so are you. Willie, turning to him now in an uncontrolled outburst, I'm not a dime a dozen. I'm Willie Loman, and you are Biff Loman. No, Pop, I'm not a leader of men, Willie, and neither of you. Pop, I'm nothing. I'm nothing. Okay, this emphasis on nothing, scum of the earth, hopeless. Now, note that although we've seen that Biff and Willie are alike in so many ways, here is one in which they differ. Willie would rather die than admit and live without pride, live without the idea that he is somehow capable of distinguishing himself. He would rather kill himself than live with a loss of such dignity, rather kill himself than live in a sense of shame and self-contempt. Not so with Biff, who is capable of saying, and even seems to take a peculiar and perverse pleasure at times in saying, I'm nothing, I'm nothing, I'm nothing. I'm a scum of the earth. It's Willie's proud resistance to that sense of ordinariness or worse that makes him tragic. And it explains why, Willie cannot bear for Biff to leave for good as he had planned without a fight, without trying in some way to hold on to some hope in him. Because even after the debacle in the steakhouse, Willie still wants to cling to some slender hope in his older son and by extension in himself. Thus, he says, you're not a dime a dozen, okay? You're Biff Loman. You're Biff Loman. Biff says, I'm not bringing home any more prizes. You're going to have to stop wanting me to bring them home. But Willie won't. Willie refuses. Now, one senses that Biff is, as we've seen, trying to escape the burden of Willie's hope and trying here, as he had done in the restaurant, to refuse that investment of hope in him by working against that tendency that Willie has been engaging in ever since Biff was a boy. But Willie insists that when Biff says that I'm a dime a dozen, no, you're not because I'm not. Willie refuses to be an ordinary man, even if he's a common man. And when we look more closely, we see that Biff's self-denigration, while it carries with it almost a sense of masochistic pleasure in relieving himself of what he hopes is the burden of parental expectation, that self-condemnation isn't absolutely convincing or even entirely honest. Somehow, it's a little too easy. When Biff tells Willie, it isn't your fault, I'm just a bum, he says it as an exit strategy. He says it as a way of freeing himself, he hopes finally, from parental expectation and from being in the house. And it's a way of saying, in effect, to Willie, don't count on me for anything. I can't bear it, and now I'm free. Okay? Well, Willie's response to Biff's claims of incapacity is vacillating. At moments, he insists that Biff, as we've seen, is still extraordinary, full of promise. And at others, he rages bitterly against Biff for failing him and for claiming that he is insufficient. It's the same contradictory pattern, in a certain sense, that Willie has enacted in relation to Biff for years. Willie says, for example, when Biff says, people ask where I am and what I'm doing, you don't know and you don't care this way. That way, it'll be off your mind and you can start brightening up again, Willie, because you won't have to think about me or have any hope for me at all. Meanwhile, Billy, just forget I'm alive, to which Willie says, may you rot in hell if you leave this house, saying that to me. Biff, exactly what is it you want from me, Pop? I want to know on the train, in the mountains and the valleys. I want you to know wherever you go that you cut down your life for spite. No. Spite. When you're rotting somewhere beside the railroad tracks, remember, and don't you dare blame it on me. Okay. Now, having examined his repressed, guilt-ridden past, Willie now assures Biff that he has been spiting him for years, despite the fact that Willie knows that he is in fact responsible to a large degree for Biff's failures after having witnessed the scene with the woman. Now, you might note that although Willie knows this and tries to deny his guilt for what he knows by claiming that it is Biff who's doing the spiting, that it is he to blame, cursing him in this way, you might note that Biff, in response to this, never directly mentions to Willie that crucial episode in Boston. In all of his complaints, in all of his accusations of Willie as being a fraud and a fake and steering him the wrong way, he never brings up Willie's greatest failure for him. But Willie knows it, and Biff knows that he knows it, so it doesn't even have to be spoken. It's subtextual. Biff's self-condemnation as an exit strategy and as a kind of voluptuous relief from the burden of expectation, that self-condemnation, that kind of masochistic self-humiliation can only go so far. Because remember, he does still resent and blame Willie for making him in part what he has become. So when Willie curses him in the scene I just read, as Biff prepares to go off and to wander again through the West, Biff vents his rage by making it clear that he blames his father, at least in part, for his failures, as he also blames himself. And he says before going, he wants Willie to face the truth, if for only once in his life. There's no point, he says, in looking for me to redeem sins that you need to face directly in yourself. Thus, he says, do you know why I had no address for 3 months, Willie? It's because I stole a suit in Kansas City, and I was in jail. I stole myself out of every good job since high school, Willie says. And whose fault was that? And I never got anywhere because you blew me so full of hot air I could never stand taking orders from anybody. That's whose fault it is. Thus, having embraced his own failure and in a certain sense trying to find relief, even satisfaction in it, another part of Biff feels the necessity to blame Willie as a causal factor in that. Well, his accusation against Willie for blowing him full of hot air is just, and he's right to force Willie to face his lies and errors. But ironically, Biff also isn't being entirely honest with himself in this exchange, because a moment later he describes how, as he ran down the steps with the pen, he looked at the sky and realized, I don't belong in an office, begging a fool, making a fool of myself, when all I want is to be out there waiting for me this minute. I say, I know who I am. Why can't I say that, Willie? Well, the implication that Biff in this moment says, no, I wasn't meant for business in New York. I want to go back to the open sky because there I know who I am. Why can't I say that? That's a lie to himself. As he has already revealed to Happy, Biff has absolutely no idea of who he is. Does he really expect that this time, after so many comings and goings between New York and the West, that he's going to find fulfillment out there? The answer to both is no. He knows that he won't find fulfillment, and he knows he has no idea who he is. In short, like Willie, Biff lies to himself here, and like Willie, he lacks self-knowledge. To put it in Willie's own idiom, Biff, too, is kind of temporary about himself. The two are extraordinary alike, except in that crucial dimension that I noted, which is that Willie is constantly struggling to assert a kind of dignity, even if it requires self-delusion, whereas Biff, in his self-delusion, refuses to struggle, it seems, and would rather simply give up and disappear. It's why Willie is tragic and Biff is not. Now, Willie, of course, doesn't know who he is any more than Biff does. But he knows who he isn't, one might say, in a way that Biff does not. Put it simply, Willie knows this. He knows that he is not ordinary. The extravagance of his dreams, their persistence, their fervor, makes him, and his inner suffering in trying to achieve them, makes him more than just ordinary. Common, yes, ordinary, no. So, paradoxically then, of Willie we might say that he has a sense of self-regard in the absence of a coherent sense of self. Biff has neither. Now, this distinction between self-regard and self explains why Willie tells Charlie that although he regularly borrows money from him, he will never accept the job that Charlie repeatedly offers him. The reason is this. Willie sees the loan as short-term, something to be repaid in some always better envisioned future. But to work consistently, to take a job for a practical man like Charlie, a man without big dreams, to do that, Willie believes, would be to legitimize his entire approach to life, to concede that his gospel of being liked as a measure of self-worth and as a means to success is a complete lie. Willie can't do that. His sense of dignity rests on the belief and pursuit of that misguided dream. At the end of Willie's cathartic argument with Biff, he discovers something that he had failed to understand about his son for the last 15 years. He realizes that Biff is presenting himself as a hopeless case in whom he should have absolutely no confidence, because Biff cannot bear to see Willie suffer and disappointed. He understands also that Biff wants to be off the hook from those expectations, but that he's also telling Willie this in part because he cannot bear to see his father live in a state of hope that will be disappointed again and again and again. And in recognizing that that is part of the motive for Biff's self-denigration, that it is in a sense an attempt to free Willie from the pain of future disappointment, Willie understands something about this series of self-humiliating comments Biff's made about himself. He sees Biff weeping after Biff says, "Pop, I'm nothing, can't you understand that?" And instead of raging this time, as he has before when Biff says that, or insisting when he isn't raging that, yes, you are something, consider what he says. Biff, crying broken, "Will you let me go, for Christ's sake? Will you take that phony dream and burn it before something happens?" Struggling to contain himself, Biff pulls himself away and moves to the stairs. "I'll go in the morning. Put him to bed," he tells Linda. Exhausted, Biff moves to the stairs of his room. Willie, after a long pause, astonished, elevated, Isn't that a remarkable thing? He likes me." "He loves you, Willie," Linda says. Happy says, "Always did, Pop." Willie, "Oh, Biff," staring wildly, he cried to me. He is choking with his love, and now he cries out of his promise. That boy is going to be magnificent. You remember when Biff had cried in the hotel room, Willie had told him to stop. Now his tears mean something to Willie, because from the time Willie returned alone from that catastrophic dinner, he has believed that his son hated him and cast him off. Now he realizes that Biff has in some way been castigating himself and presenting himself as hopeless because he cannot bear the expectations of his father, and above all, cannot bear to see his father suffer in the face of his failures. That in going off with the idea that he will never return and is capable of nothing, it's an act somehow, at least in part, of love and regard. Now, you'll remember that from the time Willie had returned home from the catastrophic steakhouse dinner, he had been torn at that moment between life and death by suicide, something that he has been contemplating on and off, entertaining and repressing from the start of the play. Torn. On the one hand, we're told Willie starts planting a garden in the yard, something that seems oriented toward life in the future. But on the other hand, we see Willie in another interior monologue, this one not so much a memory as a fantasy now, debating with himself whether or to be or not to be. And this conversation about whether to live or die takes the form of an imaginary conversation with Ben. In this fantasy, Ben serves as an inner voice, as a kind of superego, if you will, the voice of manly conduct. But it's the wrong inner voice, because Ben's only concern is that Willie should stay alive, because if he kills himself, he might be judged a coward by society and his sons for escaping in death. It never occurs to Ben, as this voice in Willie's head, that suicide would be wrong because he would be leaving Linda, the woman who loves him, behind, devastated and bereft. All that Willie seems to care about there is that she gets the insurance money. But Willie loves Linda, and he knows that she has suffered for him and with him, and yet he cannot seem to understand that taking his own life would be the greatest suffering inflicted of all upon her. And in this respect, Willie's suicide seems selfish and decidedly self-deluded. We're told that Willie says in this conversation with himself, "'Cause Linda's suffered, Ben. The woman has suffered. You understand me? Ben, a man has got to add up to something." Yes, she suffered, she suffered. He loves her and he knows that, but why then kill himself if she knows he loves him? Well, let us consider what is impelling Willie to death here. Why does he feel so drawn to suicide at this particular time in his life, and specifically this particular point in the play, even though there is another part of him we've seen that is trying still to imagine a future? Well, I think there are several reasons why he's drawn to death. First, to escape the shame of professional failure, and also what he recognizes and describes to Linda as the mental decline, really a form of madness that is setting in. Second, he's drawn to death to provide for Linda, but of course the wrong way, through the insurance payout rather than his continued presence, something at the end of the play Linda simply cannot understand. "Why did you ever do that, Willie?" she says at his grave. "Why did you do it? I search and search and I search and I can't understand it, Willie. I made the last payment on the house today. Why? Why? We didn't need the money." Well, note that in a certain sense, to feel that he was providing for Linda this way is in Willie's mind an affirmation of dignity, even if an unfortunate one. Third reason he's drawn to suicide is to assert his dignity in another way. This is the final opportunity to distinguish and redeem himself in the eyes of others, as he imagines it, quite against Ben's advice. So, as he prepares to drive to his death, he thinks that he is joining Ben on the way to Alaska. Remember, that was the big chance he passed up. He sees suicide as a kind of revisitation, another opportunity, a big chance. And he sees it, as he did the opportunity missed in Alaska, in the spirit of self-aggrandizement. Willie imagines that lots and lots of people will turn out at his funeral and lament his passing and somehow recognize when he's gone what an extraordinary man he was. And he asks himself, does it take more guts to stand here the rest of my life ringing up a zero than to die? Well, he concludes that suicide can be glorious, far more glorious than the life he is living now. But of course, his vision here too is wrong. We learn in the Requiem that only his family comes to his funeral. No one else in his business, no one among his associates seems really to care. Finally, Willie feels that he must now take his own life, because doing so would be a kind of act of revenge, an act of defiance, if you will, existentially against the world, and more particularly against Howard, who has just that day ignored and dismissed him. Suicide, Willie imagines, would somehow force the world that has mistreated him to take notice of him. Another affirmation of dignity. Well, just before he goes off to kill himself, he sees Biff crying as he pleads to Willie, please forget me, please invest no more hope in me. And I noted that in these tears and in that plea, Willie recognizes his son's tortured love for him and the pain Biff feels at disappointing him. This recognition is as close as Willie ever comes to a kind of tragic moment of Aristotelian recognition. And it is, I think, the final reason that Willie then, right after that he loves me, goes off in his car to take his own life. He does so, if you will, as an act of love, to relieve Biff of the agonizing burden of trying to redeem himself again and again in a struggle to make something of himself that he sees is torturing Biff. Now, insofar as that is still another motive driving Willie to suicide, and I think it clearly is, because his immediate response after this joyful recognition that he's crying because he loves me, is to delude himself and say the boy's going to be magnificent, but then to go off and almost immediately get in the car. Willie says he always loved me. Isn't that a remarkable thing? Oh, well, he loved me. Gotta go, baby. And off he drives. Did you see how he cried for me, Linda? Oh, if I could kiss him, I could kiss him. And that's his last words. Okay, now note that Biff does not understand that Willie's love for him is one of the things that has contributed to his suicide at this moment. But again, I think the audience does. Now, as in Greek tragedy, Willie's death by automobile, which had been prophesied at the beginning when he was driving off the road on his way to Boston, as in Greek tragedy, the death occurs off stage. Act 2 ends with Linda, dressed in mourning, bringing flowers to Willie's grave some weeks thereafter. The requiem that follows consists of recollections on Willie's death by his family, all dressed in mourning, and his neighbor Charlie. Together, these characters function something like a Greek chorus. Happy says, somewhat unexpectedly, that Willie had, quote, a good dream, and he vows to redeem Willie's life and death by winning for him, so that he feels Willie will not have died in vain. Now, in truth, we know that Willie's dream was not a good dream. It was a dream that he felt he needed in order to assert his dignity, but it was a misguided dream, a self-delusive dream, a dream that went against what he was good at, which was working with his hands. It was a dream that, in pursuing it, made him tragic, but it was not a good dream. And we also know that Happy doesn't understand that dream, really, and that Happy will certainly never redeem that dream. Now, we recognize then that for Happy, that statement is simply a kind of false consolation and an attempt to atone for the guilt that he feels for abandoning his father and perhaps for the contempt he felt for Willie. By contrast, Biff says, more realistically and accurately, that Willie, quote, had all the wrong dreams. Happy says he should have worked with his hands, as he said earlier, that was what he was actually good at. He says, you know something, Charlie? He'd come out home from a trip on Sundays, making the stoop, finishing the cellar, putting out the new porch, and when he built the extra bathroom and put on the garage, you know something, Charlie? There's more of him in that front stoop than in all the sales he ever made. The problem was he had the wrong dreams, all the wrong dreams. All right, fair enough. But note that while this is true, we must ask ourselves something at this point, and it is a crucial question, I think, in this play, because Biff puts his finger on it. Where did Willie acquire all those wrong dreams? It's one thing for Biff to say, you pump me full of hot air, full of false ideas about getting ahead and being able to steal and get away with it if you're liked. But where did Willie get these ideas that success in sales would be a function of being loved, of being popular? Well, remember that Willie lacked a father. He didn't remember his father at all, this mythic figure who had succeeded both in the bootstrap myth and in the Western myth. And not having a father, Willie says, made him somewhat temporary, uncertain about himself and how to succeed. So where then did he get this misguided conception of success by way of popularity? The answer is contained in a story that Willie tells Howard and that we need to bear in mind, I think, at the end of the play in assessing Willie's dream. Willie, in this terrible interview with a man who is firing him, says, I met a salesman when I was young in Parker House in Chicago. His name was Dave Singelman. And at the age of 84, he made his living still. And when I saw that, I realized that selling was the greatest career a man could want. Because what could be more satisfying than to be able to go at the age of 84 into 20 or 30 different cities and pick up a phone and be remembered and loved and helped by so many different people? Do you know, when he died, and by the way, he died the death of a salesman in his green velvet slippers and the smoker of the New York, New Haven, Hartford going to Boston. When he died, hundreds of salesmen and buyers were at his funeral. In those days, there was a personality in it, Howard. Now we know. This man, Dave Singelman, was Willie's inspiration and model. Willie wanted to succeed like this old man he saw when he was a young man, not realizing what else must have gone into Singelman's success. the hard work that Willie never saw because he only saw him when he was 84 years old and famous. Willie never knew that. As a result, Willie associated popularity, being loved, with success in all the wrong way. This, then, one might say, this misassociation of how you become successful is Willie's tragic mistake that he makes again and again. The idea that as a salesman, you'll be like Dave Singelman. People will attend your funeral because they love you, and rather than imagining that they love you because you were a hard worker who succeeded in business, you'll succeed in business because they love you. He's got it completely wrong. It's the essence of his tragic error. It is, at the end of this play in the Requiem, only the pragmatic Charlie who unexpectedly and clearly understands the most essential thing about Willie's life and tragedy. He doesn't evaluate whether or not the dream was a good dream, as Happy imagines, or the wrong dream, as Biff suggests. Rather, he simply takes Willie as he is, and with an unexpected lyricism, understands that given that dream, Willie had to pursue it in isolation, and right or wrong, to pursue it in the face of a hostile world. And in describing him, he says, as a salesman, Willie was a salesman. Whether it was right, whether it was wrong, doesn't matter. And for a salesman, there is no rock bottom to life. He didn't put a nut or a bolt. He didn't tell you the law or give you medicine. No. The salesman, he's a man way out there in the blue, riding on a smile and a shoestring. And when they start not smiling back, that's an earthquake. A salesman has got to dream, boy. It comes with the territory. Well, Charlie, like Arthur Miller, then sees the common man, the salesman, as inherently heroic, as worthy of tragedy. There's a kind of isolation out there, as he says, riding on a smile and a shoestring, facing hostile territory every day and facing the likelihood that if they stop smiling back at you, if they stop buying, then you will fail. It's that awareness, in a sense, of how the dream, right or wrong, made Willie tragic, and Willie's struggle to achieve it, that comes from the most unlikely source. And at the end of the play, we're left only with Linda, who understands only that her husband is gone, and she cannot understand how, if he loved her, he could do this. Okay, my next lecture will come to you after the spring break, and I will try to present them on Tuesdays and Fridays as if we were having class face-to-face. I will also be sending you back this week a report on your midterm exams. And finally, when we return, not this week, but the following Tuesday, we'll be doing comedy. I think we could use some right now, so please read Aristophanes' Lysistrata. Be well.